Audio lecture for Unit 3, Contemporary West, Crisis and Absolutism in Europe. This will also include the wars of religion that are associated with the Protestant and Catholic counter-reformations. 1550 to 1715 is the time period. All right, we're going to start by talking about Spain. At this point in time in the 1500s, the late 1500s, King Philip II is on the throne in Spain. And King Philip II had championed Catholic causes throughout his lands, the lands that he controlled at home as well as his empire. While England became the leader of Protestant nations in Europe. England at this point is under the authority of Queen Elizabeth I. So in the 16th century, a lot of religious wars broke out all over Europe. This is even after the Peace of Augsburg had been signed in the German territories in 1555 that ended religious warfare, at least in that part of the continent of Europe, at least for about a couple of generations. But it was picking up in the rest of Europe, and in particular as Calvinists and Catholics became more militant towards each other. Now, Calvinism is another branch of Protestantism. It's the one that's a little bit more militant, a little bit more anti-Catholic even than Luther had been. The whole idea of predestination and all of that as well. So, we have a lot of Calvinists. Calvinism has spread throughout Europe and become more and more popular. And of course, now we have the Catholic Counter-Reformation trying to counter that growth. King Philip II of Spain wanted to consolidate the lands of his empire, which included, of course, on the continent of Europe, Spain and the Netherlands, but also abroad across the Atlantic, his possessions in the Americas, and even he had some possessions in Italy, in southern Italy. He wanted to consolidate all of them under Catholicism. He referred to himself as the most Catholic king and Spain as the most Catholic country in Europe. Philip II attempted to strengthen his control in the Netherlands by crushing Calvinism, which had grown in that area. But he was resisted by a rebellion led by William the Silent. Now, William the Silent was the stadtholder of Orange. Sometimes he's called William of Orange the First, or William the Elder of Orange, because there's another William of Orange we'll talk about at a later time that is a relative of his. So William the Silent led this rebellion, and this is when the Netherlands, a portion of the Netherlands, would break free from Spanish control and become the Dutch Republic. In 1558, Elizabeth Tudor came to power in England and came to be Queen Elizabeth I. She also helped to fund the rebellion in the Netherlands against Philip to try to counter Philip's attempts to control her and England. You see, if you remember what we discussed in an earlier unit, Philip II had been married to her older half-sister, who was Mary I of England, aka Bloody Mary. And he had been hoping while Mary was alive that they would end up having a child that would then rule over both England and Spain, and therefore Spain would have control over England. When Mary died with no heir, that left Philip out of the equation for any kind of control over England. He initially tried to convince Elizabeth to marry him, and she rejected him. So from this point on, they will be enemies. Philip II, Catholic, Elizabeth I, Protestant, and the showdown between their two nations, which nation was going to be the most powerful nation in Europe, which would control the most territory overseas, etc., commences. So, as I said, Elizabeth Tudor came to power in England, became Elizabeth I in 1558, and the Church of England, under her, began to follow a more moderate form of Protestantism. The Church of England had been Protestant since Henry, her father, Henry VIII, had made it Protestant, but had not really undergone a lot of spiritual reform until his son, Edward VI, came to the throne. After Mary's attempt to put England back into the Catholic category, now Elizabeth is trying to restore Protestantism once again, and she decides to take a middle-of-the-road approach, a moderate form of Protestantism, not as radical as Calvinists or even Lutherans, but not as rigid as it had been under her father's reign. So this moderate form of Protestantism and England, of course, became the leader of the Protestant nations in Europe. More moderate Protestantism, but she is now seen as the face of Protestantism in Europe, whereas Philip II is seen as the face of Catholicism in Europe. And their two countries are basically throwing down against each other on the world stage. Now, these conflicts led ultimately to Philip trying to invade England to restore Catholicism there, but also to enforce his own control over that nation. One of the reasons why he decided to do this was not just because he had felt that he had the right to rule over England since he had once been married to the former Queen of England, but also Elizabeth had started to fund the revolt of the Netherlands against Spain. She had funneled money and arms into the hands of William the Silent and those rebels in the Netherlands, and they had wrenched themselves free and formed the Dutch Republic. This made Spain very angry. This made Philip II very angry. So he decides that he is going to once and for all put a stop to Elizabeth I and a stop to England. So in 1588, he built a massive Spanish fleet of ships called the Spanish Armada. He launched this armada way too soon, before all the ships were ready to sail. Ultimately, it will be defeated by the faster yet smaller English ships. You will be doing an assignment based on a documentary about the Spanish Armada, and you will get a lot more detail about how this all went down in that assignment. So when you watch the documentary, you'll want to take some notes on it and maybe add those notes into your guided notes in this portion of the lecture. Anyhow, suffice it to say, the English end up being successful. A storm actually was part of the reason why the English were successful against the Spanish Armada. The British will start to refer to it as the Protestant wind that worked in their favor and helped them to not only, a lot of the Spanish ships will be broken up on the rocks in the English Channel, but they will capture some Spanish ships, set them on fire, and then let the wind take them into the fleet to set the rest of the fleet on fire. Upon the return of the ships that were left of the Spanish Armada after being defeated, the fleet was battered by storms, like I said, en route around Scotland and Ireland, and it will limp back unsuccessful. By the end of Philip's reign, 10 years later, he was a defeated man. Spain was no longer the great power that it had been at one time, and England began to create a world empire. So we start to see the decline of Spain and the rise of England as a world power. Now in France, we also have wars of religion that ultimately start to filter into a challenge for which branch of the royal family is going to control the French throne. So, with the French Wars of Religion, you see we have conflict between Catholics and Protestants. That was at the heart of this, but it was also between different branches of the royal family. During the 1500s, France encountered a series of civil wars known as the French Wars of Religion, roughly 1562 to 1598. Some of this happened because in the 1560s, Henry II, who had been the king of France had died, and he had 3 sons that could inherit the throne after him, but none of them were very strong. His wife, Catherine de' Medici, will act as regent for all 3 of those sons. Ultimately, this will lead to some challenges coming from other branches of the royal family. Now, the Huguenots, as we discussed in a previous lecture, were the French Protestants influenced by John Calvin. It was illegal to be a Protestant in France. France was an officially Catholic country, but there were a great deal, about half of the nobility in France were actually Huguenots in their hearts. And this quickly became a political threat to the crown in France. There were also a number of ultra-Catholics that opposed the Huguenots, and they recruited large armies to fight against the Huguenots. And some of these ultra-Catholics were even more Catholic than the Valois Catholics. That's the name of the family that was on the throne in France. So we ultimately have tug-of-wars going on politically as well as religiously in France as a result of this. And again, you'll learn more about this in your textbook readings as well as in the packet that you are doing for Unit 3. So those 3 branches of the royal family, the Valois on the throne, the ultra-Catholics called the Guise family, and the Bourbon family that are the Huguenots, all will be sort of fighting against each other for control of the throne. Ultimately, what will happen is a Huguenot political leader named Henry of Navarre, member of the Bourbon family, Bourbon branch of the royal family, will be able to succeed to the throne as Henry IV. And when he does so, this will bring the French wars of religion to an end. Catherine de' Medici was his mother-in-law. She was the one that had married into the Valois dynasty on the French throne. It will be her daughter Margot or Margaret that will marry Henry of Navarre to try to bring an end to the French wars of religion. Ultimately, however, there's a lot of soap opera stuff that goes on before this marriage can be arranged, and even after the marriage took place. There was a great showdown between the 3 branches of the family where a lot of Huguenots in the Bourbon family would be massacred. It's called the Massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day. I will explain this more in detail in class, and I will also post a podcast for you all to listen to in the module so you can learn more specifics about this. Ultimately, however, the peace will be made. There will still be Valois blood on the throne, and after Henry takes the throne, becomes Henry IV. So it will establish a new dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty. But it's because he is married to a Valois princess, it keeps the Valois line on the throne in France, but it locks out the Guise family completely from the throne. Again, more of this will be discussed in your packet and in your textbook as well. But because Henry of Navarre, or Henry Bourbon, who becomes Henry IV of France, had been a Huguenot, had been a Protestant, this is going to be a problem for a lot of the French citizens who are so Catholic. Because France is a predominantly Catholic country, and it is an officially Catholic country. So when he becomes king, in order to make peace, in order to stop the wars of religion between the Catholics and the Protestant, he will convert to Catholicism. He says Paris is worth a mass, meaning that those living in Paris, which is the capital city, which is kind of the most populous city in all of France, it's worth it for him to get their support, for him to convert to Catholicism and to maintain peace throughout the entire country. So he converts to Catholicism, but by 1598, he will issue the Edict of Nantes. Now, the Edict of Nantes basically recognized that Catholicism is the state religion in France, but it also gave the French Huguenots, the Protestants, religious and political rights. Basically, the Edict of Nantes made it no longer illegal to be a Protestant in France. You just had to worship in private. You could not worship in public. But it legalized it so they could no longer be persecuted. The Edict of Nantes will be in place until Louis XIV, a later king that we'll discuss later on in this unit, revokes it with the Edict of Fontainebleau. But this will successfully end the wars of religion in France. The Edict of Nantes, 1598, issued by Henry IV, who had been Henry of Navarre, the first of the Bourbon kings, the new Bourbon dynasty in France. Now, other crises in Europe. There was, of course, population decline in Europe that had happened since had started with the Black Death. We discussed that before. It had started to make a comeback by the time we have all these new products coming in from the New World. But we will eventually start to have some other issues by the time we get into the 1600s that will cause some shifting in the population once again. We also see that Europe witnesses severe economic and social problems during this time, including hysteria of witchcraft trials, which contributed to both the economic and the social problems in 17th century Europe. A lot of the economic problems that we see in Europe were caused by the loss of Jewish and Muslim artisans and merchants, especially in Spain after the Reconquista that had been fostered by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain about 150 years before. There were also economic problems in Italy. Italy had been in steady decline since the Age of Exploration had kind of cut the Italian middlemen out of that overseas trade. And currency policies in Spain became an issue. As I mentioned in a previous unit, Spain thought that they had an endless supply of gold and silver coming in from the New World that they could spend on anything rather than developing their own industry, spending it to buy stuff from other countries. Well, that is finally going to dry up, that gold and silver from the New World, and that's going to cause issues for Spain. So all of these things contribute to economic and social troubles going on, which will lead to some things like hysteria and witchcraft trials and other problems socially in Europe. One major economic problem, of course, was the inflation or the rising of prices due to this increased amount of gold and silver that was in the circulation, the currencies of Europe. Europe's population growth during the 16th century, also because so many people were able to survive because of the new products coming in from the New World. Eventually, however, by the time we get into the mid-1600s, it increased the demand for food and land while driving up the prices. So yes, we had a population growth finally, recovery from the plague, but now we have more mouths to feed and we have demand for more food and more land places to live, and the prices are continuing to rise because even though there is more food available than there had been 150 years prior, there's not enough to keep up with the population growth. Europe's population had leveled off by the time we get to 1620, and eventually in the 1650s we see more war and more famine and plague leading to declining population numbers once again. So if you think of it as a cycle, you see that the population growth and decline comes and goes in different cycles. And here we are once again in a population decline. Eventually, religious zeal and hunts for heretics, some of that Catholics versus Protestants and Christians versus Jews and Muslims, etc. All this religious zeal extended to the belief that some people were possessed by the devil, which extended to witchcraft. Okay, the fear of witchcraft led to the accusations and trials of over 100,000 people in Europe, most of which were single or widowed women. They were usually the primary targets, and they were usually the ones that would be burned as witches. Now, the last of the big wars of religion, okay, will be the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War took place between 1618 and 1648. And the war did begin as a war of religion. It started over religious conflicts, but it continued on, and the second half of the war really was fought for political reasons. So that's why we sort of talk about the 30 Years' War being the last of the religious wars, but it also is the first war that becomes more of one for political reasons and balance of power rather than religion coming out of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. So the 30 Years' War, where was it fought? Primarily in the area that was known as the Holy Roman Empire, or those Germanic principalities in Central Europe. And it began between Catholics led by the Habsburg dynasty, the Holy Roman Emperor in Austria territory, and Protestant forces that were located in an area of the Germanic principalities called Bohemia. It's modern-day Czech Republic. Ultimately, it was a showdown between the Catholics and the Protestants, but eventually other powers in Europe, all of the major powers in Europe except for England, became involved in this war. And this is largely because since the Habsburgs controlled the Holy Roman Empire, and since the Habsburgs also controlled the throne in Spain, remember there were German Habsburgs as well as Spanish Habsburgs, there were a lot of other nations in Europe that saw the fight between the Catholics, the Habsburgs, and the Protestant forces in Bohemia as a way for those German Habsburgs to snatch up more territory in Europe. And many other nations in Europe felt that the balance of power was being upset by this, that the Habsburgs had too much power, had control over too many lands. Land equals power, and ultimately this will cause many other nations to get involved. Oftentimes, even Catholic nations getting involved to support the Protestant cause against the Habsburg forces, solely because they don't want the Habsburg family to dominate so much territory. They want to restore balance of power and to reduce the power of the Habsburg family. Ultimately, the 30 Years' War will end in 1648. Ultimately, it ends because both Sweden, that was a Protestant nation, came to the defense of the Protestants in the German principalities or the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the French. Now, the French were actually Catholic, remember, but they came and supported the Protestant cause against the Habsburgs because the French and the Habsburgs had been rivals for centuries. And if the French want to become a stronger nation, they need to reduce the power of both the Spanish Habsburgs to their south and the Austrian or German Habsburgs to their east. So ultimately, it became about politics and balance of power. France, even though they are a Catholic nation, will support the Protestant cause against the Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War because they want to reduce the power of the Habsburg family. Ultimately, after Sweden and France do support the Protestant cause, by 1648, the Protestant cause has been able to defeat and wear down the Habsburg faction. In 1648, a peace was signed, the Peace of Westphalia, sometimes called the Treaty of Westphalia, and this will bring an end to the war, and it will divide up the Holy Roman Empire, or those German principalities, into even more independent states that could determine their own religion and foreign policy. So ultimately, the 30 Years' War brings an end to the Holy Roman Empire as a political entity. And it ultimately, yes, there will still be Habsburgs that have control in parts of the German principalities. Austria, the Austrian Empire becomes the new Holy Roman Empire, but it's smaller. It's much smaller. It's Austria and Hungary eventually and other areas around it, but it will never be as large as it had been, say, under Charles V back in the 1500s. By reducing the power of the Habsburg family and reducing the number of lands they control and kind of forcing a wedge between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs or German Habsburgs, this will ultimately finally create a balance of power in Europe, where all of the major nations in Europe all equally control about the same amount of land and about the same amount of power, and keeping a balance. However, as we just discussed, we do know that Spain will start to decline, especially after the Spanish Armada in 1588 failed, and we start seeing England increasing its power. Simultaneously, after the 30 Years' War is over, France is increasing its power because France has helped to defeat the Holy Roman Empire in the 30 Years' War. So the new up-and-coming nations are France and England and even the Dutch Republic, but since they had wrenched themselves free from Spanish control. So the new balance of power in Europe is a much stronger France, a much stronger England, and even a stronger Dutch Republic, and a weaker Habsburg Spain, and a weaker Habsburg Austria, I guess you would say, or the Austrian Empire. Now let's talk about what happens in England after Elizabeth I dies. Elizabeth I never married, and as such, that means that she recognized she was going to be the last in the line of the Tudor dynasty. She didn't marry because she was concerned over if she had married, say, the King of Spain or France or somewhere else, she was concerned that that would mean that it would seem as if England lost its sovereignty, that they had become part of a greater Spanish or French empire, and she did not want that. As the wife is subordinate to the husband, they would argue that she was subordinate, England was subordinate to her husband's country. And that's one of the reasons why she refused to marry King Philip II after the death of her sister Mary. So she recognized that meant that the Tudor line would end with her. It's one of the reasons they called her the Virgin Queen, because she never married. But there was another branch of the British royal family that were set to take the throne once Elizabeth died. Elizabeth was cousins with the Stuart dynasty that controlled the throne in Scotland to the north of England. So the next person in line for the throne was her cousin, James, who was the King of Scotland. He will come to power and start the Stuart dynasty in England by becoming James I. He will be both the King of England and the King of Scotland. This is when we start kind of referring to that as the, British Empire, okay, this union. And he came to power with the death of Queen Elizabeth. The Stuart line of rulers thus begins in 1603. A new dynasty, the Stuart dynasty in England. Now, the problem is that, yes, he's technically Protestant. He accepted that England would remain a Protestant nation. But James I believed in the divine right theory of kings. He believed that his power should be absolute and never questioned. And this contradicted with the beliefs of most Englishmen who accepted that the king and parliament kind of ruled England together. The parliament having control over taxation, the king having control over religion and most everything else. But the king and the parliament for years, or the queen, I should say, in some cases, had to work together when it came to taxation and other kinds of things like that in England. Well, James the First did not believe that. He did not believe that he should have to go to Parliament to get permission to raise taxes and those kinds of things, because he believed that he should be an absolute ruler and that God placed him on the throne and therefore nobody should question him. This is going to get him into, some arguments with some folks in the Parliament, in the British Parliament, who were used to having those kinds of rights. Now, remember, folks, this goes all the way back to the signing of the Magna Carta back in the 1200s, when certain British, or I should say English at the time, nobles forced the weaker King John the First at the time to sign this document saying that the king is not above the law, and there were certain prerogatives, meaning rights, that the English nobles in the form of parliament have that the king cannot touch. So this is 400 years before this is when this document was signed, and James is now trying to kind of erase that. And this is not going to go over well with a lot of the English nobles in particular. Ultimately, when James the First dies, this animosity between the king and parliament, they had kind of gone back and forth while he was king, but it had not become a huge disaster. Okay, it will come to a head and become a huge disaster once his son Charles the First comes to the throne. So the second in the Stuart line, Charles the First, when he comes to the throne, many of the more radical Protestants in England, which were Puritans, they were actually English Calvinists, even though England was an Anglican country. It's Protestant, but the Church of England is not as radical as the Calvinists, the Puritans were. Those Puritans were trying to push the envelope and trying to create more reforms in the Church of England, to more spiritually reform the Church of England than it had ever been before. And a lot of these Puritans hoped that when Charles I came to the throne, that they might be able to, influence him in some way. But he was having none of it. As a matter of fact, even though he was officially Protestant, officially Anglican, he actually had a lot of high-ranking friends that were Catholic, and he actually tried to put more stringent rituals into the Church of England that were more Catholic light rather than really Protestant. This will lead thousands of Puritans to leave for America, including those, that wanted to escape what they called religious persecution in England, and many of them established themselves in the New England part of North America. Charles I and Parliament will go through a tug of war for several years, especially when Charles I decided that he wanted to raise taxes, and the Parliament did not allow him to do that. So ultimately it came to a showdown. Charles I will disband Parliament, will try to rule outright like a divine right absolute ruler in England without Parliament after disbanding it. For a while, he's not able to get the funds that he needs for wars that he is fighting, so he has to call them back into Parliament. It's a mess. It goes back and forth between the two sides, but ultimately it leads to a showdown between 1642 and 1651, really. England was faced with a civil war between those that supported the king and him, being an absolute monarch, and those that supported Parliament and wanted to limit the power of the king. Okay, so those that supported the king and becoming more of an absolute monarch were known as the Cavaliers. Okay, the supporters of the kings, you see them there in the picture. And those that supported Parliament, and Parliament having more powers, being able to limit the power of the monarchy, they were called the Roundheads. Okay, and they were the ones that supported the parliamentarians. Many of them were Puritans that wanted to try to push for more religious reforms as well. So not just, fighting against the absolute authority of a king, but also fighting against, what they see as religious persecution. They want to purify the church even more. And the Roundheads came under the authority of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a member of Parliament. He had been elected to the House of Commons. He himself was a Puritan, and he raised an army that the Roundheads will fight under, the New Model Army, to fight against the king's forces. This is civil war. The king and his forces versus the Parliament and their forces. Okay, 1642 is when this begins in England. Ultimately, Cromwell and the parliamentarian forces, or the Roundhead forces, were victorious, and they were able to capture Charles I along with many of his supporters. They put all of them on trial for treason against the people of England, and Charles I, the king himself, was executed for treason. He was cut his head off. This was a big deal, okay? This happens in 1649, and ultimately, this was when England declared itself a commonwealth, that they will rule themselves as a commonwealth without a king. The Parliament will be in charge. Both the House of Lords, which was the traditional body that was, controlled by the nobility. It was a hereditary position, as well as the House of Commons, which was the elected positions, which of course were only elected by the wealthy people. Not everybody had the right to vote. We haven't gotten there yet. Anyhow, England was declared a commonwealth, and they will govern themselves without a king at all for a number of years. Cromwell ultimately will be called the Lord Protector. And ultimately, when he is in charge, he is sort of in charge of the Parliament. And the Parliament, of course, is in charge of the government. But since he's in charge of the Parliament, he's kind of in charge. He's not a king. He's the Lord Protector. But while he's in charge, because he's a Puritan, he starts to launch some religious reforms throughout England that not everybody likes. Now, the Puritans, for one thing, they did not just want to purify the church, okay, which meant they tore down all of the statues in churches. They broke all of the stained glass windows, putting up plain glass windows, stripping down the churches of any decoration. All of that decoration, they said, bordered on idolatry, so they wanted to get rid of all of that. But Cromwell also thought that art and culture in society could lead people away from Christ. So he wanted to purify society from all of those things as well. So, the symphony concerts were canceled. The Shakespearean dramas in the theater were canceled. All of the art and culture was stripped away from England. As a matter of fact, sometimes Cromwell, because of this staunch conservatism of his, he's referred to as No Fun Cromwell. Ultimately, he will rule England with an iron fist, enforcing this kind of Puritan reality until his death in 1658. After his death in 1658, the people of England realized that they were not real sure about this Commonwealth idea. Yeah, they weren't crazy about the king trying to govern as an absolute monarch. That's why they killed him, remember, Charles I. But they also weren't crazy about this, no fun Cromwell and all of his policies either. So after Cromwell's death, the people of England determined that they wanted a restoration of the monarchy in England. And Charles I's son, he actually had two sons. They had fled England when the English Civil War began, worried for their own lives, especially after seeing that their father ended up being executed. So the oldest of the son, another Charles, okay, Charles II, will be invited to come back to England and rule as king in England as long as he agrees to certain terms that Parliament via the people of England want. For example, one of the things that they wanted with this restoration of the Stuart line of rulers with Charles II was they wanted him to promise that there would not be any Catholics that would be allowed to participate in the governing of England because some of his father's cronies had been Catholic and were controlling aspects of the British cabinet. So he had to promise that. He also had to allow for the fact that Parliament would always maintain control of the purse strings of raising new taxes. He was not going to be able to raise taxes without their approval. Now, Charles II is delighted to be king. He was, living in exile for many, many years, never thought he would be king after seeing what happened to his dad. So, of course, he was delighted. He's agreed to all of the terms that they wanted him to. And so we say we have a restoration of the Stuart monarchy with Charles II. We also have a restoration of art and culture throughout England. Charles II sometimes is referred to as the merry monarch, meaning, happy monarch, merry monarch, M-E-R-R-Y, because of this. But he's also referred to as the merry monarch, just to be completely candid, because he had lots of mistresses. Okay, yes, he was married, but he and his wife, his queen, were never able to have children. But Charles II had many illegitimate children with mistresses. He had so many mistresses scattered all throughout England, and so many illegitimate children that's another reason he's referred to as the merry monarch. Anyhow, the point being, even though he had many illegitimate children, none of them could rule. None of them were legitimate heirs to rule. So Charles II will rule England until his death in 1685, so 1658 to 1685. But since he dies without a legitimate heir, his younger brother, James, will become the next monarch. Okay, so he will be James II. He ascends the throne in 1685. Now, the problem was James II had converted to Catholicism during the time that he and his brother were living in exile. He had been married before to an English princess. He had had 2 daughters with her. He was Protestant just like she was, as a good Englishman was, but when she died and when he was living in exile, he fell in love with a Catholic princess and ultimately now was going to have more children with her and raise them Catholic. When she gave birth to a son, this, of course, concerned the British Parliament greatly because, first of all, they had already forced James II's brother, when he was alive, to sign a document saying that no Catholic could ever have any role in the government of England. It's called the Test Act. Now we have a king on the throne who is Catholic, and that goes against that Test Act. And if he's going to raise his son to be Catholic, and he's going to be the next king, does this mean that England is going to cease to be Protestant and become Catholic once again? This is why we have one more revolution happen in England. 3 years after James II takes the throne, 1688, we will have the Glorious Revolution. Okay, so James II, like I said, a devout Catholic at this point, Parliament objected to his policies of appointing Catholics because its members, Parliament's members, were afraid a Catholic dynasty might be possible. And so, in 1688, once again, the Parliament, the English nobles, as well as those in the House of Commons, invite instead James II's daughter, Mary, who had married into the Dutch, one of the Dutch noble families William of Orange. Y'all remember I talked about William the Silent on a previous slide. Well, one of his descendants, it was either his grandson or his great-grandson, now William of Orange, is married to James II's oldest daughter, Mary. Now, she had been raised a Protestant. This was with James II's first wife when he was still Protestant. And since she technically was, had the Stuart blood in her veins, okay, she technically was the daughter of the king, they saw this as an out. The British Parliament saw this as an out. They invited Mary as the member of the Stuart family and her husband, William of Orange, who were both Protestants, to come from the Dutch Republic and invade England and take over the monarchy in England. William and Mary were offered the throne. And this was unheard of. Now, James II, after knowing what happened to his father, Charles I, lost his head, remember? He was not interested in pushing that envelope. So, this is one of the reasons why we call it the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, because he pretty much gave up without a fight. He withdrew his claim to the throne, and he allowed for William and Mary to rule jointly over England. William and Mary were, however, limited in the power that they had. They had to agree to sign and accept the English Bill of Rights, which outlined specifically the certain powers that the king and queen would have jointly, along with certain powers that the Parliament would have, neither one of them being able to touch each other's powers. Checks and balances of sorts here. This English Bill of Rights will ultimately create the first constitutional monarchy in England, which basically means the power of the monarchy is limited by the power of Parliament officially and forever. This is the reason why England will have a constitutional monarchy by the end of the 17th century, when most of the rest of Europe will have absolute monarchies in power. This is the reason why. So the Bill of Rights, what are some of the things that are in the English Bill of Rights? They will sound fairly familiar to you because they're similar to some of the things that are enshrined in the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. First and foremost, the Bill of Rights stated that Parliament alone could make laws and levy taxes. They have the power of legislation. They are the legislature of England. And the king could propose laws, but if they weren't accepted by the Parliament, they would not become law. The king could ask to have new taxes raised, but if they weren't agreed upon by the Parliament, they would not go forward. Other things in that, armies could not be raised without the consent of Parliament either, so there would be no such thing as martial law, the king raising his own armies to fight against Parliament, if you will, like had happened in the English Civil War between Charles I and the Roundheads in Parliament. And also, another thing that was enshrined in the English Bill of Rights was that the English citizens could keep arms and have a trial by a jury of their peers. Very similar to the things that we see in our own Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights ensured that Parliament would be part of the English government from this point forward, would never be able to be fully challenged by a monarch ever again. And it laid the foundation for, like I said before, a constitutional monarchy. Limited power of the king, balancing that power of the king with the power of the people that are represented in Parliament. Now, again, remember, not all citizens have the right to vote for the House of Commons in the Parliament, but we're not there yet, but it's a step in the right direction. Parliament also enacted a couple of other acts, the Tolerance Act of 1689, which granted Puritans, but not Catholics, the right of free public worship. Now, simultaneously with that going on in England, okay, where absolute monarchy falls apart in England, and instead we have constitutional monarchy, which is limiting and balancing the power of the monarch with the power of a legislature. Simultaneously, we have in the rest of Europe really strong monarchs becoming absolute in their power. And we see this happen. The epitome of absolute power comes in the form of Louis XIV in France. Louis XIV was an absolute monarch whose rule was admired and imitated by other monarchs throughout Europe. Louis XIV is regarded as the best example of absolutism in the 17th century throughout Europe, not just in France itself, but throughout Europe. Louis XIV was able to strengthen the control of the government under his own authority and ultimately stabilized France politically, economically, and socially. But he would be the primary power. No parliament, no legislature, no nobles. He would be the strongest power in all the land. Absolute monarchy. Now, prior to Louis XIV becoming king, there were a couple of cardinals. They had been cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church, Cardinal Richelieu and Cardinal Mazarin, who had worked diligently to try to weaken the Protestant power in France that had been allowed by King Henry IV's Edict of Nantes. They were trying to do this ultimately to strengthen the power of the king. These cardinals actually were working for the king. Okay, Cardinal Richelieu worked for Louis XIII, and Cardinal Mazarin acted as regent when Louis XIV became king at the age of 5. So, of course, he couldn't make decisions for himself when he was 5 years old, so Cardinal Mazarin acted as his regent. Both of these cardinals worked diligently to make sure the power of the French king was absolute. They continued to build the power of the king, and they will eventually build it so much that they no longer feel they have to tolerate Protestants like Henry IV had thought. Okay, now Henry IV would be like the great-grandfather of Louis XIV. Henry IV had originally been a Protestant, and that's one of the reasons why he signed the Edict of Nantes to end those religious wars after he converted to Catholicism again. But by the time we get to Louis XIV, he does not feel that he needs to tolerate those Protestants anymore because his power is so strong, he doesn't need to worry about them challenging him. All right, so Louis XIV ruled without the assistance of a royal council at all. He had complete control of foreign policy, complete control of the church in France, and complete control of taxes. Now, even though he was Catholic, he had complete control over the church. And this is largely because predecessors before him had made sure that the Pope agreed to allow French kings to appoint their own bishops. Now, this happened many, many generations before Louis XIV, but ultimately this will work to his benefit. And this is one of the reasons why France does not succumb to, the entire nation does not become Protestant, instead remains Catholic. Now, one of the things that Louis will need to do, however, is make sure that France has enough money, has a strong enough economy that they cannot be challenged by any outside forces. Because remember, France always is concerned about the power of Spain. They're always concerned about the power of England. They are rivals to both of them. They're also rivals to the Austrian or German Habsburgs. And so they're surrounded by all these different nations. So they need to be sure that they have enough power, enough wealth, so they can raise their own standing army and defend themselves, or even perhaps fight wars to gain more territory for France, to make France a stronger nation. So one of the ways that Louis XIV will do that is by hiring the smartest guy in the room, okay, to handle the finances of France, who will answered directly to Louis XIV himself. This man was named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and Colbert helped to make France more powerful economically by improving trade, improving communications, building more roads, building more bridges and those kinds of things, transportation, and by creating a merchant marine fleet. All of this would bring more wealth into France and limit the amount going out. It's mercantilism, folks. Jean-Baptiste Colbert created a French mercantilist system that will benefit Louis XIV greatly. It will make his power stronger by making the economy of France stronger. Louis XIV was said to have claimed that he was the state, not the people living in the state. In fact, he said, "L'état c'est moi." I am the state. So France is Louis, not the people living in France, but Louis himself. And the people living in France are living there at the bidding and the will of Louis. So it all has to do with keeping the power in Louis's hands and keeping it absolute. To ensure that his Bourbon dynasty will dominate Europe, not just dominate France, but now dominate Europe, Louis XIV developed a standing army that he was able to pay for with all of that wealth coming into the nation thanks to Jean-Baptiste Colbert and his mercantilist policies. So Louis developed a strong standing army, and he waged a series of wars, 4 of them, between 1667 and 1713. These are often referred to as the Wars of Louis XIV. Okay? Ultimately, he will win territories in these wars, and every time he wins territories, he diminishes the influence of his enemies, of his rivals, and he increases his own power. Land equals power, and power equals influence. Ultimately, Louis left the legacy of an absolute ruler who ultimately strengthened the power of France by strengthening his own power. Machiavelli would be proud of Louis XIV. Louis XIV also worked diligently to control the nobles in France so they would not be able to challenge his authority by limiting their power and limiting their influence. He built this grand palace of Versailles outside, about 15 kilometers outside of the city, the capital city of Paris. He moved there himself, and he forced every noble family in France to spend a certain amount of time each year living there with him in Versailles. That way he could always keep a watchful eye on them. He also forced them to participate in all of the festivities there, which of course they'd have to spend a great deal of money to have the clothing, and that he forced them to gamble and those kinds of things. This way he reduced their economic influence as well, ultimately emasculating the nobility, keeping the nobility under his thumb. It's kind of brilliant, actually. Keep your, friends close, keep your enemies closer. That's exactly what Louis did, keeping his enemies closer. He was not going to be challenged by any other noble in France. The nobles in France ultimately had no power. All the power was in the hands of Louis. And Louis also made his bureaucrats from the upper middle class folks instead of from the nobility. This way he did not have to give those bureaucratic positions to the nobles. He instead formed an alliance with the stronger middle class that was on the rise in France. Those merchants, those people that would bring more wealth into France ultimately. Louis's political policies and lavish lifestyle, however, and the cost of his wars, ultimately by the end of his life, will leave France with great debts. And after his death, his successors are not as strong as he is. And so they're not able to maintain that strength and power. So the animosity among those people that Louis defeated in those wars, will ultimately come back to haunt Louis' successors. So it left France with great debts and surrounded by enemies. So even though under Louis XIV, France will be even more powerful in the absolute monarchy, he kind of sets the stage for a great fall of his successors. And by the time Louis XVI is on the throne, there will be a massive revolution in France that will depose the monarchy completely and establish a republic. That is for a different unit. We're still a ways away from that. That won't happen until 1789. Now, what about in Central and Eastern Europe when it comes to absolutism? Okay, so we've talked about how in England they moved away from absolutism and moved towards constitutionalism. We talk about how in Western Europe, in France in particular, we have a strong, really, really strong absolute monarchy forming, okay, especially under Louis XIV. But what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe? Okay, after the 30 Years' War, there were more than 300 independent German states in the central part of Europe. That's a lot. Of those 300 plus independent German states, Austria, which was still under the authority of the Habsburgs, that had formerly been the Holy Roman Empire, was still a great power. But we had another new up-and-coming great power in those German principalities, and that was Prussia with a P, Prussia. Okay, so Prussia and Austria ultimately become the strongest of these German independent states. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Prussia in particular. Okay, Prussia had been Brandenburg and became Prussia. It was, for a while it was called Brandenburg Prussia, but ultimately in the northern part of the Central Europe, the power of Prussia becomes great by the time we move into the later 1600s, after the 30 Years' War is fought. Frederick William the Great Elector was the leader of Prussia during that period. And as we move from into the late 1600s into the early 1700s, he laid the foundation for Prussia becoming a great nation by creating the fourth largest military force in all of Europe. Now, Prussia is not a very large nation. If you look at it here on the left-hand side of the map, you see it's not tiny, but it's not huge either. But he creates the fourth largest military force in all of Europe when he's land-wise one of the smaller of the countries. That means that oftentimes Prussia was referred to as a military with a state rather than a state with a military. The military becomes the most important thing in all of Prussia. Okay, Frederick William will centralize power in Prussia around himself by setting up what is called the General War Commissariat. Okay, this commissariat was put in place to levy taxes, meaning raise taxes for the army and to govern the state. About half of the state's budget every year would go to the army. It was that important. It was that large. Now, in the new Austrian Empire, as what had once been called the Holy Roman Empire was now called a smaller Austrian Empire, still fairly large, okay? The Austrian Empire was established by the Habsburg family, who had previously provided emperors for the Holy Roman Empire. They were what was left after the loss of the 30 Years' War. Actually will continue to build their power as well. The Habsburgs created a new empire, including present-day Austria, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. The Austrian monarchy never really became fully centralized or even an absolute monarchy like we see in places like France and even in Prussia. But it remained a collection of territories held together by the Habsburg emperor. And one of the reasons why it's more loose-knit is because not all of those living in the Austrian Empire are of the same ethnic group or even of the same language base. you have the Austrians who speak German and are Roman Catholic. You have the Czechs who are, that's where Bohemia was, where the whole 30 Years' War began, who spoke Czech and were Calvinist. And you had Hungary, which were, spoke Hungarian and had a number of different religions, including Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So you have a polyglot empire or a multi-ethnic empire instead of, a more solid empire that has something that holds it together, like a common language or what have you. This will eventually be an issue for the Austrian Empire moving forward in the generations, as we will see as we go through future units in this class. Now, in Eastern Europe, however, in Russia, Peter the Great will create an absolute monarchy in Russia. Okay, Russia will emerge as a great power under Peter the Great during his reign. Unfortunately, others after him will not be able to effectively duplicate how much absolute power he had. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, let's back up a little bit before we get to Peter the Great. In the 16th century, in the 1500s, in Russia, Ivan IV became the first ruler to take the title of Tsar. Now, sometimes you'll see Tsar spelled C-Z-A-R. Sometimes you'll see it spelled T-S-A-R. The T-S version of it is more Russian spelling. The C-Z version of it is the more, I guess you would say, westernized spelling of it. But both of them are considered correct. Now, Ivan IV, who became known as Ivan the Terrible, expanded Russian territory, and he crushed the power of the Russian nobles known as boyars. And when he crushed their power, taking lands from them, killing a bunch of them, this is when he became known as Ivan the Terrible. But under Ivan IV, we finally do have a centralized government in Russia for the first time under a strong centralized king or czar. By the way, the Russians take the term czar for their king because it reminds them of Caesar. And since they were Eastern Orthodox Christianity, they traced it all the way back to the old Roman Caesars. Okay. All right, so following the end of Ivan's dynasty, though, in 1598, a group of powerful nobles that had escaped Ivan the Terrible's cleaning house of the boyars decided that they would select from among themselves the new czar. And this new czar would be Michael Romanov. He will establish a new dynasty of czars in 1613, and those czars will ultimately, the Romanov dynasty will control the throne in Russia until the Russian Revolution happens in 1917. Okay, so a very long time, 1960, excuse me. Now, Michael Romanov will eventually, even though we don't really call Peter the Great a Romanov, he actually married into the Romanov family, and he will become the greatest czar that ever lived. In 1689, he became the czar. As I said, he had married into the Romanov dynasty. He will modernize the military and make Russia a power in European affairs. One of the ways he does this was by introducing Russians to the culture of Western Europe. He argued that the reason why Russia had lagged behind Western Europe for so many years is because they had not fully modernized like the other parts of Europe had been modernized. Russia still had feudalism. They lacked a lot of the same technology that had started being developed in the rest of Europe. And he wanted Russia to become more like the West so it could compete with the West. One of the ways he did this was by going on a grand embassy. It was basically a big trip that he took, a European-wide trip where he traveled all throughout Europe. He tried to travel incognito, meaning in disguise. so he could learn more about the Western cultures. But ultimately, it was difficult for him to really travel in disguise because the man was almost 7 feet tall, and he stuck out like a sore thumb. Everybody, knew that Peter the Great was 7 feet tall, and here you have this Russian fellow coming through your town, even though he's not claiming to be Peter the Great. It's pretty obvious that he's Peter the Great, because he's the only person really that existed in Europe that was 7 feet tall, for heaven's sake. Where at this point in time, the tallest that men actually ever got was maybe 5'5" or 5'6". So, he stood out because of that. Anyhow, ultimately, Peter will bring back all these Western ideas with him after his grand embassy tour is over. He comes back to Russia and he builds a new capital city based on the Western style. He builds it on the Baltic Sea. In this city, he will name St. Petersburg after himself. He built it to look a lot like the Western capitals of Europe. It looks a lot like, his palace looks a lot like Versailles Palace. He actually has a couple of palaces, the Winter Palace and Peterhof. His other palace, they are built in the same kind of style as the Versailles Palace that Louis XIV built, which is in the Baroque style, very ornate and ostentatious to reflect the glory of himself. He called St. Petersburg, which was built on the Baltic Sea, it's the westernmost point in Russia. He called it opening a window to the West, so they could become more like the West, could view the West, could open themselves up to becoming more westernized as a result, a window on the West. Now, speaking of art, yes, art always reflects the time period that we're living in. So art after the Renaissance will also reflect the building of power of kings. It's in parts of Europe with absolute power. The artistic movements of Mannerism first and then Baroque second began in Italy and then reflected spiritual perceptions of the time as well as political perceptions. Okay, first of all, we have Mannerism. Mannerism was an art form that emerged in Italy before spreading throughout Europe, kind of like the Renaissance had done. Mannerism would be late Renaissance time period. It's sort of the transitional period between the Renaissance period artistically and the Baroque period artistically. But Mannerism kind of broke away from some of the Renaissance principles of balance and harmony and moderation, and started representing people as elongated to show suffering and heightened emotion rather than just showing them perfect. And this will sort of be a bridge leading into the next phase, which is Baroque art, which is highly emotional, lots of lights and darks, lots of emotion, lots of violence even shown in a lot of the art. The characteristics of Mannerism are reflected. Probably the most well-known artist that reflects these works is El Greco, whose figure, he was from Spain, but he actually was a Greek man who was living in Spain. That's why his nickname was El Greco, which just means the Greek, okay? But he was living in Spain, of Greek descent, and his figures were elongated and contorted, showing you violence, showing emotion, lots of lights and darks, to show some, and sometimes not balanced. You see a lot of light on one side of the painting instead of it being balanced in the straight middle. And this will, like I say, be a break away from that symmetry and balance and harmony that we had seen in the Renaissance. Now, the new movement that comes next is Baroque. Baroque replaced Mannerism. Now, it first was embraced by the Roman Catholic Church during the Catholic Counter-Reformation. As a matter of fact, Baroque art and architecture was utilized and promoted by the Roman Catholic Church to show the glory and grandeur of God and the glory and grandeur of the Roman Catholic Church, as opposed to the drab, undecorated Protestant churches that we were seeing pop up everywhere in Europe. Okay, they wanted things to look ornate, to represent the glory of God and the glory of the Roman Catholic Church. So that's why I say it's embraced by Catholic architecture, especially in Catholic nations too. Nations, those kings that wanted to promote themselves as absolute monarchs, kind of took a page from the Roman Catholic Church and said, hey, we're going to use Baroque art and architecture to promote the glory of ourselves and our nation, just like the Roman Catholic Church used it to promote the glory and grandeur of the Roman Catholic Church and of God. So especially in the Habsburg courts of Madrid in Spain, in Prague, and part of the Austrian Empire, in Vienna, of course, the heart of the Austrian Empire, and in Brussels. We really see it in Louis XIV's Versailles Palace, as well as Peter the Great's Peterhof and Winter Palaces. Baroque churches and palaces were magnificent, and they reflected a search for power and glory. Lots of gold, lots of ornate design. Oftentimes, it looks a little gaudy even, a little over the top with the gold and with the decoration. Baroque art usually looks very fancy, like almost even overly fancy. Now, probably one of the most famous Baroque artists was Lorenzo Bernini, who captured these ideas with his work on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, which is the heart of the papacy, the church of the papacy, was being remodeled for years and years and years. Once the exterior had been completed in the Renaissance period, now he was in charge of redesigning the interior. And you see here some of his work, the Baldacchini, as it's called, which is known as the throne of St. Peter. Very gold and very highly decorated and ornate, and just try to show the glory and grandeur of God and the glory and grandeur of the Roman Catholic Church. Like I say, similar ideas in places in palaces of absolute monarchs like Louis XIV and Peter the Great as well. We also need to recognize that during this time we have a golden age of literature. Now, even though Shakespeare was a little bit earlier than this, he's in the 1500s during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I in England. He will sort of kickstart what we know as a golden age of literature throughout Europe during this time. Shakespeare and Lope de Vega both were prolific writers of dramas and comedies that reflected the human condition. William Shakespeare was a famous playwright and actor whose understanding of human psychology enabled him to write comedies and tragedies that are still studied to this day, as many of you are aware because you study them in 9th and 10th grades, as I think even in 12th grade here at Providence School. In Spain, Miguel de Cervantes is another important literary genius of the time. He wrote one of the greatest literary works of all time called Don Quixote, where he's using, he's using satire, he's using hyperbole to try to poke fun at the Middle Ages, but also to try to show the glory of the age that they're living in now. The story of Don Quixote elicits the idea that hard work and visionary dreams are a requirement of the human condition, that is what makes us human. And again, you can see how this is really an offshoot from the Renaissance ideal of humanism, that if you have the ability as a human being to work hard and make this world a better place. As in England, Spanish plays became very popular, and touring companies of actors brought current productions to all parts of the Spanish Empire. Lope de Vega was the most famous Spanish playwright, writing nearly 1,500 plays that are considered witty, charming, realistic, and action-packed. And so the theater really becomes an important cultural art in all of Europe during this time period, the post-Renaissance, the later Renaissance and post-Renaissance era. Now, when it comes to political thought, if we're talking about, intellectual fervor during this time, we need to look at the political thought, and this has a lot to do with the changes that were happening in politics during this time period, meaning the rise of absolute monarchy in most of Europe, but also the challenge to absolute monarchy that we saw happening in England with the rise of constitutional monarchy. Okay, so with political thought, we basically have two sides developing during this time. Okay, Hobbes representing the pro-absolutism model, and Locke representing the pro-constitutionalism model. So let me explain here. They both Hobbes and Locke wrote very different books about political thought in response to the English revolutions. Both of them were English, by the way. Okay, when it came to the English Civil War and then the Glorious Revolution, they both had a very different take on whether or not these were good things. Okay, so let's talk about both of them. 17th century political thinkers, as I said, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke wrote about political power and influence future philosophies of government for years to come. So why are they important? Because they will influence future philosophies of government for years to come. One of them, Hobbes, influencing those that support the idea of absolute monarchy being necessary for a state to be a good, stable, strong state. Okay, John Locke, of course, influencing the future of philosophies that believe that no, the power of the governing structure should be limited and balanced with the power of the people. Constitutionalism. Okay, so let's talk about Thomas Hobbes first. He wrote a book called Leviathan. Now, Leviathan just means it's a sea monster, basically. But in this book, he wrote this book to kind of outline and deal with what he saw as the problem of disorder in modern society. Now, Hobbes asserted that people actually make a social contract to form a state. So he does support absolute monarchy ultimately, but he does not believe that the king is what makes up the state, like Louis XIV said when he said, "I am the state." Okay, Hobbes asserted instead that people make up the power of a state, but that the people make a social contract with a governor, a king, to form a state. They give power to the governor or a king to form a state in exchange for protection and peace. In other words, the social contract is between the people in a state and the monarch. But Hobbes argued in Leviathan that once the people give that power to a monarch in exchange for him protecting them and creating a peaceful society for them to live in, law and order, that power could never be taken back by the people. It was given to the monarch and it stayed in the monarch's hands forever and ever. Okay? Absolute power, Hobbes argued, was needed to preserve order in society. It was the only way to keep society from spinning into chaos. And rebellions against a monarch must be suppressed because all they will bring is chaos. So, one of the things that we need to make note about Hobbes is, yes, he supports the idea of absolute monarchy, but he does not believe in the divine right theory of kings. He does not believe that they have absolute power because God gave them absolute power. He believes that a monarch has absolute power because the people have given him that absolute power. Once that absolute power has been given to him, it remains in his hands and remains in the hands of his successors forever and ever. The people cannot take it back. He believed absolute power of a monarch is necessary in order to keep law and order in society, to keep society from spilling into chaos. He did not believe that men had any, regular general men, regular people had the ability to govern themselves, that they needed an absolute monarch to govern them, to keep society from spinning into chaos. Okay, and he basically referenced what had happened in the English Civil War as his justification for this. He said, look what happened when they killed the monarch, they spun into chaos. They ended up having this commonwealth under Cromwell, and it became kind of a mess, etc., etc. Now, John Locke is on the other side of the coin. Now, he does, like Hobbes, he does believe that the power comes from the people and the state. And he also believes that those people do enter into a social contract with a governor. They give the governor the power that he has in exchange for that governor ensuring law and order, ensuring that their natural rights will be protected. This is where they differ. John Locke believed that man in his natural state enjoyed freedom and had certain natural rights. Hobbes believed that man in his natural state was greedy and selfish and did not believe in the idea of natural rights and natural freedoms. Okay? John Locke believed that a man in his natural state enjoyed freedom and had certain natural rights. And those natural rights were life, liberty, and property. Okay? In John Locke's 2 treatises on government, which he published the year after the Glorious Revolution in England, to kind of sum up what he saw had happened, Locke argued against the absolute rule of one person. Instead, he stated that government and the people have mutual, government meaning the monarch, and the people, meaning the people in the state, have mutual obligations to protect each other. The people enter a social contract with their governor, give him the power, and in exchange he promises to protect their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. But this is the big difference. Locke argued that if the government usurped its power, if they do not hold up their end of the bargain to protect the natural rights of the people, if they do something that infringes upon the natural rights of the people, then the people do have the right to abolish that government. They have the right to rebel because the monarch, is no longer ruling with the, quote, consent of the governed. You see the difference here. So John Locke's ideas actually support constitutional government, limiting the power of the monarch with the power of the people. The monarch is given his power by the people only if he promises to protect their natural rights. The second he stops protecting their natural rights, they have the right to abolish that government and to establish something new. The ideas of John Locke, folks, are basically what's going to launch a new era known as the Enlightenment, which we'll discuss in more detail in the next unit. And the Enlightenment is basically what is utilized by the American revolutionaries and the French revolutionaries to abolish their governments and establish republics. Okay, our nation here in the United States is based on the principles of the Enlightenment, which are born out of the ideas, the political thought of John Locke and natural rights. Again, we'll discuss this more in the next unit. So again, we'll discuss this more in the next unit, but just to sum up, Locke's ideas, not Hobbes's, but Locke's ideas would ultimately be used by American and French revolutionaries in the 18th century. And his influence can be found in the American Declaration of Independence as well as in the U.S. Constitution. But as we will also see, his ideas will be influential in the French Revolution in the document, the Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. Again, we'll discuss this in a later unit, but this is to be continued. So when we get to those later units and discuss these things, I will bring this up again. And you need to be sure that you are able to link all of these different units together because history scaffolds, it builds upon itself. What happens in one part of history eventually influences another thing that happens later. So you need to start seeing those connections as we move through these units.